I'm Sarah Barchard, Senior Clinical Trial Manager at DCN Dx.
And I'm Dan Simpson, Director of Regulatory Affairs at DCN Dx. This is Expert Insights. There's no host today. Sarah and I are going to talk through something a lot of people are dealing with right now, and we come at it from two different chairs.
It's hard to miss what's going on. As of late May, notified bodies are warning that IVDR submissions have slowed down so much that some of them might have to close, because companies are waiting to see what the IVDR revision looks like before they file. And the old deadlines are still running out. So that's what we want to get into today. What the waiting really costs and what it looks like to plan well when you have to sell in both the EU and the US.
It's great to be chatting with you today, Sarah.
I'm so happy to be here, Dan. Looks like we're going to talk through some of the things surrounding the IVDR today and what's going on in the industry. For background knowledge, everybody, there was a proposed change to the IVDR at the end of 2025. And Dan and I are going to talk a little bit about, there was also a document that the notified bodies issued at the end of April, I believe, early May, talking about some of their concerns that are encompassed in that proposal there.
Yeah, so I think there's always a lot of angst and concern amongst our clients, right, Sarah, about IVDR. And we'll hopefully add some calming effect to people out there. But also, we're going to be doing a webinar soon about how you can plan for both a US and an EU submission. So, that will probably be more of the second part of this podcast. But I think probably on people's mind, first of all, is this revision to the IVDR.
Right. So, Dan, do we want to talk a little bit about what primarily was included in those proposed changes? I think maybe just from your perspective, the really big highlights would be helpful for people. And then maybe we talk a little bit about what the concerns are from the notified body's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I think everybody knows, the transition to IVDR has not been very smooth. It's been rather bumpy. It's been going on for more than 10 years now. And really what the problem is back in the day with the in vitro diagnostic directive, 90% of IVD companies didn't have to go through a notified body. You could self-declare. Now it's kind of inverted. Now 90% have to go through a notified body. So guess who's really stressing? It's the notified bodies, because they have this massive workload now. And so that has been the issue. So the EC, the European Commission, has realized this. And what they're worried about now is that there could be a public health crisis, because if companies can't get their products on the market in the EU people are going to be the ones that suffer from a public health perspective. So they're stepping in now and they're trying to alleviate some of the burden on the notified bodies. And it really comes to the Class B and Class C devices, Class B being the more moderate risk classification and Class C being higher risk, even though the highest risk is Class D. So with Class B devices, they're really talking about with technical documentation that you could have a whole product family be under the same technical documentation, where before it was very much product to product. They're talking about that. That's in their proposed document. Then there's a lot of just administrative things that they're trying to alleviate. So you mentioned what some of the concerns the notified bodies have now, which is interesting, because before they were like, oh, this is too much stuff, right, for us to do. Now they're saying we don't think that the new proposal is actually going to create public health risks, because it's going to be not enough information to prove safety and efficacy. So it's kind of what the EU is dealing with is the old regulatory pendulum swing, right? It's we went too far, now we're going too far the other way, and when are we going to actually go in the middle?
Yep.
Clients are waiting now to see what happens, which might be a good thing to do, especially if it's a new product, because we're not exactly sure where it's going to end up on that pendulum swinging risk assessment. I think for the most part, a lot of it's not going to change the requirements. It's going to be more on the administrative side, but there could be some things about technical documentation that might be more lenient. It's kind of a decision whether you want to proceed with what the requirements are now or wait, but we can talk a little more about that, I think.
Okay. I mean, it sounds to me like what you're saying is not necessarily that the framework or the requirements are going to change with this proposed change, right? It's more that we're going to see a less burdensome pathway than what's originally proposed in the IVDR if they incorporate some of the changes. Now, the changes aren't, I think that they release that the proposed changes, right? But they're not supposed to go, or really they're not going to do anything with them until the end of the year, right? And then they're going to put them out for comment, right? Just like they do here. And so we're not going to see any like real decision on any of those changes for probably another year.
That's correct. And I think it's also important to note, we're talking about new products here too. I think that there hopefully isn't the confusion. If you're transitioning your products from the IVDD to IVDR, those timelines are still in effect, because those timelines, like Class Cs, you should have already set an application or sent an application in to the notified body. You should have that in place because that is a requirement. So that is still continuing, because Class C products don't have to actually be on the market for many years still, but you still have to have an agreement with a notified body and get some of that application stuff done. That isn't being affected by this transition. So just a note on that side.
In the States, right, we talk a lot about if something is a Class 1 or a Class 2 or a Class 3, and that's kind of how we set up our clinical studies, and we decide on a regulatory pathway. Maybe for some people, can we just talk a little bit about, what a Class B product really looks like and what a Class C product is considered in the US and the EU, and then how that's going to change, right, our regulatory pathway?
So the pathways are definitely different. I mean, they're visibly different. The words are all different. They don't make it easy, right, for the average person to understand. But when it comes down to it from a development perspective, you're usually doing the same validations, the same tests. Where it really comes out differently, as you said, the regulatory submission, the pathway, and the documentation. The documentation is much more, I would say, aggressive on the IVDR side, a lot more of it, and it has to be more proactive. Going to the risk classification, that's a great place to start. Obviously, in the US, you have Class 1, 2, and 3. Over in the EU, under IVDR, you have A, B, C, D. What that means, obviously, is you get classified different, right? In the US, you look for product codes that are already on the market that's similar to yours, and it'll tell you if you're Class 1, 2, or 3. And then we'll even tell you what the submission type, and you look for predicate devices to do a 510K pathway. Over in the EU, they have classification rules that you go through, and it doesn't have anything to do with what's already on the market or not. It's exactly how your device performs. So that's really the biggest difference, is that there's no such thing as a 510K under the IVDR. So you could have a test that has 1 million predicates in the US, but over there, you're going to be classified according to those classification rules. So you might be a Me Too 510K over in the US, but you could be like a Class C or even a Class D potentially in the IVDR, and require a lot more documentation and validation type studies. So that can be where the disconnect can happen.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to kind of look at that, right, when we're planning for a product that could potentially be, if we have a client that comes in and they want to market their product here in the US and also in the EU at some point, it's important for our teams to get together to kind of do a parallel planning, right? Because like you were saying, the documentation is different. Maybe not necessarily the way that we run the study, right? We've talked about this before, that I think you agree that we could potentially run a clinical study that generates evidence to support both a FDA submission and a submission in the EU, right? We could do that with a single protocol. We could do something where it has like a different version depending on the regions, only because the protocol a lot of the times, or the plan, right? The study plan has to get submitted to an ethics committee before we can execute on the studies. And that's the same for the analytical pieces, right? In the EU versus here in the US. That's another documentation piece that differs. Like you were saying, is where here in the US, we may have a plan, but we don't necessarily have to submit it to the FDA and get them to sign off on it, or even internally sign off on it before we actually execute on the study, right? That's a big thing in the regulatory documentation piece for an IVDR study.
Right. And I think, what you're referring to is what they call the performance evaluation plan and then report. So performance evaluation under the IVDR includes scientific validity, analytical testing, and then what you're talking about, the clinical testing, the clinical validation that you would do. A lot of people talk about performance evaluation in the US and they might mean analytical, they might mean clinical, but it's not that comprehensive definition that they have in the IVDR. And to your point, you have to have a plan of how you're going to do all of that. And a lot of times in the EU, it means you do a lot of literature searching even before you do any of your analytical and any of your clinical, because you have to prove that scientific validity part, which isn't as big in the US. And so you have to prove that. And they also talk about state of the art, which in the EU, state of the art, you often think of, right, in the patent sense of saying, oh, I'm state of the art because I'm novel and good. In this case, it's not good to be novel and good necessarily, because you want to show that there's a lot of evidence out there that your device will be safe and effective because there's other products on the market that have good safety and performance out there. That's what you have to deal with as far as differences. Again, the documentation is, you can't leverage a lot of things that you've done before like you can in the US. You just don't go off of standards like you do in the US. You do go off of standards, but you have to also go beyond that.
Right. And so I think that points to what you were talking about earlier, which was like a proactive, right, with the IVDR versus a reactive, right? So we're planning everything on the IVDR space. And it's not that we're not planning it right here in the US, but there's a lot less of a case that you have to build before you can be looking at.
You're dead on.
Go ahead.
It's not like we don't do that innately, right, as developers. But you have to document it, and you have to show you are planning in the IVDR. Or again, like we always say in the regulatory world, right? Hasn't happened if you didn't document. Another thing we wanted to talk about, Sarah, was the self-testing devices, what we call over-the-counter in the U.S., and then near-patient devices, which we call point of care. And the differences there. Maybe you could start with the clinical study side and kind of how we do it in the US, and then we can talk some of the differences that might happen.
Yeah. So for a CLIA-waived test that's over the counter here in the US, right, we're designing a study that's essentially going to be looking at how a lay user is going to interact with the test and if they're going to be able to get the expected result, if it's safe for them to use it, and if it works the way that we say it is. And we do that in a number of ways. We test from a user standpoint how easy it is for them to interact with the product. So is it easy to open the packaging? Is it easy for them to follow the instructions? Is it easy for them to conduct the test? When we do something that's more of a point of care, you're talking about a user who's not necessarily laboratory trained, but they are medically trained, right? So they can handle infectious samples. They know generally how to keep themselves safe from potential contamination, but it may be that they haven't run these high complexity assays where you're putting, multiple samples onto a larger instrument and then testing them in a laboratory setting. It may be that you're putting a specific sample that you've collected in the clinic onto a, something that sits on a bench or something that sits on a tabletop, and then testing that. And we're looking for something that gives results in a quicker amount of time, essentially. So those studies, we look at from, again, the user standpoint, depending on if they're a lay user or somebody who's more medically trained. It just depends on the test. But the FDA, I would say in the last 5 to 7 years, they've seen more of these tests come through, especially with the pandemic, right? When we saw all of the upper respiratory tests that were coming in and being submitted, the agency they've been scrutinizing them more, and they also have become more understanding, I think, and the pathway to getting those to market has become less burdensome than it was initially, I think. I think in the IVDR, under the IVDR, right, those tests are looked at differently and they require a special type of review only because they're considered class Cs, right?
Yeah, so, right. So the self-testing devices are all class C.
Yeah.
So that can be a little different than in the US, right? Near patient or point of care, they're classified at large like they normally would be. What I see as the difference from what you were just saying, everything you said in the US is under that CLIA waiver guidance, right? So they're very prescriptive. They being FDA is very prescriptive about the type of test, more prescriptive anyway, right? If you look at the guidance, it says you need to look at the orientation of an instrument, right? All these things that users could potentially screw up, right? And so they think in environmental conditions, right, is one of the big things. In the EU, when you do what's called a conformity assessment pathway, which is the submission pathway for IVDR. There is a section in those annexes, these big long annexes that are in IVDR, about how you go through the technical file review. There's a section about near patient and self-testing assays. All it really says in there is that the notified body will take into account the intended user and the intended use environment and ensure that the validation that the sponsor is doing addresses the needs there. So you go from very prescriptive on the US side to every product could be potentially different over in the IVDN. And now hopefully if you do CLIA waiver testing in the US and then go to IVDR, that the notified body will say, the FDA liked this type of testing. Hopefully the notified body does too, but you're not guaranteed. They may want some extra testing. That's something you have to be, I think, cognizant about as a manufacturer.
You were talking about how potentially, right, the ethics committees could accept clinical work similar to what we do here in the US for a CLIA waived product. And we talked a little bit earlier that we've seen some developers and manufacturers, right, wanting to plan for a US and EU market. And so I think that's something really important for clients to consider when they're designing, their clinical evidence and their analytical evidence, that we're satisfying hopefully both of the markets, or at least we can draw from the single data set that we've generated to be able to satisfy the requirements or the information that's needed for both of the submissions.
Yeah, I think what the message here is then, if I look at it from more of a regulatory perspective, is that you can design a single protocol to rule them all, right? Or rule them both. And once you do that, it comes down to more about showing that the US population versus the EU population are going to be a similar data set from the disease state, right? And ethnic diversity and how that might affect that particular disease state. That's where I've seen FDA at least have a lot of issues of using foreign data. So the EU will be the same way. And you have to remember, too, the EU is not one country. It's a region of many countries and many ethnicities. So there's different competent authorities within the EU, even though they all kind of talk to each other in IVDR. I think you and I had talked about this when it comes to clinical studies, even though like a submission for the IVDR is all of the EU. when you're doing a study in the EU, you have to go to the individual competent authority to do that study, especially if it's what you call an interventional trial, which is like the IDE in the US. That's who looks over the clinical study. And you'll probably go to an ethics committee within that country. So that's where there's a big difference there. And so you really have to make sure in the EU, it gets a little more complicated about where you're running the study and is it really representative of the whole EU as well. That's where it can get a little complicated with the IVDR.
For sure. I think also it'll get a little bit complicated with the IVDR because each of the ethics committees could have potentially, right, a different interpretation or a different requirement for the study, depending on the region that they're in or the country that they're in. And I think from just a bird's eye view, right, the focus for a lot of the ethics committees is more on the continual evaluation of the product over its entire life cycle versus here where we have the IRBs, we will submit it to an independent review committee to have them review the study for, research and if the subjects and their rights and welfare are being protected when we're running the study, right? But the notified bodies in the EU, they're really looking at, okay, what is the performance evaluation look like for a product over its entire time, not just before you submit it to have it reviewed and cleared for use to the general population.
Yeah, I think it's good that you made that differentiation there. So the ethics committees for the study are basically like the IRBs in the US. So they're going to look at the same things you said. But the difference there is if you're running it in different regions, countries in the EU, you might need several different ethics committees in those regions. So maybe that's probably a good point to clarify here is that the competent authorities in the EU, which are the FDA equivalents for the individual countries, do not do the reviews of your product like the FDA does. They outsource it to these things called notified bodies. So that's who's doing the review. So that's what you're talking about. And yes, they are more concerned. I think we might talk about that a little more in the post-market side. But you're never done with the IVDR. In the US, you do your 510K and you're like, wipe your hands and you walk away, right?
Right.
And you never have to continually go back. You do have to do that in the IVDR. I think, too, before we leave the clinical study topic, what would I say to you, Sarah, if you came to me and said, what subjects do I need? In what countries? What's FDA going to say if I use EU? What would I tell you? I'm quizzing you right now.
Oh, our favorite thing, Dan. We go in with a precept.
Yes,
why wouldn't we do that? That's our favorite thing.
That's the answer I was fishing for. Yes. Anything to do with clinical study design, it should always go through FDA. But here is the problem, though, with the IVDR, is there's no pre-sub equivalent over there, unfortunately. So you can't really get in front of the competent authorities. But the notified bodies are getting better about talking to sponsors, so you can get some of that information, but it's just not going to be in a formal meeting like that. So that's kind of where the IVDR lags a little bit, is on the early communication side. You're going to have to fight a little harder with the notified bodies to get some answers on what the EU might require for their study versus the US. So, but in the US, we have the beautiful pre-sub process where we can talk to FDA about what they want in the study ahead of time before you get your AINN in your 510K that says you didn't do it right. So,
which you have a lot of experience doing. And I think a lot of our clients give Dan a gold star about that, his interactions, during the pre-sub process and during the review process. I think we've had a number of clients, right, really say that they're happy with the services that they get from regulatory, and Dan's seasoned in interacting with the agency. So I would encourage anybody who has any questions about the clinical or the analytical work that they're needing to do for their product to come and chat with you offline about the need.
Well, thank you for that.
Pre-sub is our favorite thing.
It is. We're both aligned. We both love the pre-sub.
We do. So Dan,
okay.
Now that we've talked about pre-subs, which are great. What about afterwards, though? Post-marketing?
Yeah. Yeah. Different philosophy over in the EU about post-market, right? So in the US, we have complaint handling, we have adverse event reporting, we have recalls. All of that is very reactive, right? And it's not that the US, it's not that the FDA doesn't see the value of being proactive, but it's just the requirements revolve around reactive methods of collecting and data. So you don't know about it until something's going wrong in the field, basically. In the EU, they've always described the post-market process as being vigilance. So that word vigilance already tells you, right? The meaning behind the word is that you're being vigilant. You're looking ahead. You're monitoring, you're surveilling the situation, looking for anything that might indicate there's a problem before there's actually an injury or a death or a problem of any type, right? And so that means that over in the EU, it's more about doing, again, literature searches to see if people maybe are using your product off label. There's the concept of feedback where it's not necessarily a complaint, but the customer is saying things that would improve your product and make it better and thus might actually improve the quality later on. That's not really a quality problem now, but is an improvement that would help the user use it correctly. There's also surveys and things like that. There's all these things that are more engaging with the customer. And then again, we come to the point where you have to prove you're thinking about this ahead of time. So in the US, we create procedures in our quality system for complaint handling and for adverse event reporting and recalls. That's how we plan for it, is we do that. You have to do that in the EU too, obviously under your quality system. But here you have to do what's called a post-market surveillance plan ahead of time. You have to show that to your notified body. Application, I think, you have to do it. So you have to think about it even before it's developed. You have to think about how you're going to monitor this in the field safely and how you're going to show you're vigilant about this, right? And so that's completely different than in the US. So you have to think about it early. And then every year you have to do a report off of that plan once it's on the market to show you are meeting your objectives of that plan. You're keeping things down, adverse events down to a certain rate. You're doing all of your follow-ups that you're supposed to, right? Checking in with the customers. So that really is just a completely different and more resource intensive process than in the US. So you have so much more technical documentation, but you also have to do all these systems. Really, it's like 1 to 2 more people for somebody to maintain under IVDR, honestly. And that's what people have to know.
And like you were saying, right, that there's so much more documentation, and all that documentation lives in the technical file under the IVDR, right? So you have to continuously, there's reports and things like you were saying, but they go into the file, which you continue to update every year with those reports.
Every year, because you get audited every year. Yes.
Right? Yes. Versus here in the FDA, like you said, we do your 510K, we're done and dusted, and the FDA looks at it, either approves it or rejects it, and then that's kind of it, right? I don't go back and update the files for the study or the files in the technical documentation unless we need to.
There's what's called the general safety and performance section in the technical file, and you list all of your standards that you're following, and they're all harmonized. If one of those updates, you have to analyze that update, and then you might have to update your technical file. You might have to do, if it's, let's say, an analytical CLSI standard updates, you might have to do new analytical testing to satisfy that. Where in the US, you wouldn't have to do that anymore unless you did a new submission. So that's the pain of IVDR. Yeah.
One of the pains, right? So Dan, what do you think? So we've talked about all of the different pieces that are different with the IVDR versus the US. We talked a lot about the documentation and how much more manpower it just requires. Do you think that contributes to really why people are waiting to submit? Or do you really think that it's this proposed change to the IVDR that has people pausing and potentially waiting to submit their applications?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a little bit of both of those things, right? I do think, especially regulatory professionals, clinical professionals, right? We like to know what the rules are exactly, right? And I think we know that it's not going to change that much, but not knowing exactly what it's going to be, we would rather wait if we could, right? Again, I think if you have a new product, you might be more inclined, right? And a lot of clients are, you're probably going to go to the US first and let the EU kind of sort this out if you can, right? But if you're getting pressure to get a product onto the EU, then you're going to have to move forward with this and hope your judgments are right on how they're going to change things. I think you brought up a good point that it's probably going to hopefully be less rigorous. So it would be easier to go from a more rigorous system to a less rigorous system.
Right. And I think that's something that we work with clients, right? When they come to us, when we develop, like a regulatory strategy for them or something like that, we'll walk through the markets that you want to go into and the timeline on those. And then I think that, Dan, you probably talk to clients depending on the type of assay or instrument that they're talking about bringing to the market, right? We do an assessment of kind of what it would mean to wait and what it would mean, to go ahead and submit your application. But that's for new, right? It's
right.
I think we're aligned on the products that are going to transition or part of the transition from IVDD to IVDR.
Yeah, and keeping in mind that transition now, because what the notified bodies say is that we're done pushing back the timelines for transitioning to IVDD to IVDR. They've already kicked it. I mean, essentially, it's already out to the end of this decade now.
Yeah.
Essentially. But what they did is put it on these little points where you have to have already, if you're Class C, you should have already applied to a notified body. But so you need a little bit of documentation there. So what they're ensuring is that you're doing a little bits before you get to the end and need to be fully compliant. So if you're transitioning and you're hoping that at the end of December, they're going to kick it back again, that's probably not going to happen because they're done doing that. But for new products and things like that, that's where this is going to come in and what you're actually going to do in your validation on these transition products. So what for the transition products, what you're doing now is setting up the systems for your technical file documentation and things like that. Your post-market surveillance plan, I think, has to come in, and maybe even your high-level performance evaluation plan. But that's just a high level. We're going to do this type of analytical testing. We're going to have a study that kind of sort of looks like this. And we're going to do all this literature searching because literature searching is a part of clinical evidence in the EU.
Dan, this was so helpful for me to have you talk through this. I always really enjoy our chats. Is there something that you thought about today that we didn't cover? I mean, I know, so we have an upcoming webinar.
Yes, we do.
And so I don't want to spoil anything that you have planned for that. But are there any things that we left unanswered or kind of hanging out there that you can think about for today?
I don't think so. I think this is a good high level discussion that will then maybe, get people's, hungry for the webinar coming up, hopefully. I think the message should be that from a development perspective, things don't change much. You're still going off of a lot of the same standards, but it's really what that submission, we call it in the US. And see, this is always the problem now. They're called completely different things. So the submission in the US and then the technical documentation in the EU is if you're going into the EU, it's having a good regulatory and quality kind of base, because that technical documentation is also rooted, and this is something I didn't talk about. It's really based on your quality system, because you have to have the systems to support that technical documentation and all the reviews that have to continually happen. So that's what notified bodies are looking for. And that's why they do a quality audit on top of the review, because it's all tied together.
Yeah, and that's all great information. I think if somebody was, looking for support with their IVDR technical documentation, that I'm hoping that they're finding this helpful and that they'll attend our webinar just to see, in more granularity, the things that you actually will go through when we do that webinar next week, just because, again, Dan has so much experience working with the FDA, but also from the IVDR side with a number of our clients that are doing a transition or planning to move into the EU market.
All right, great. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for talking through this with me today.
And if this is on your plate right now, come spend an hour with us. Dan and I are presenting a RAPS sponsored webcast, the IVDR Transition in 2026, Parallel Regulatory Planning for EU and US Market Entry, on June 17th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It's free and you can register through RAPS. We'll go through the case studies behind everything we talked about today, show how planning both markets early keeps these problems from showing up late and costing you. If you want to talk through our program afterward, you can reach us at dcndx.com/contact. Thanks for listening to Expert Insights.